Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Arizona. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1888, when Arizona Territory was still 13 years from statehood, the Callahan homestead stood alone against the backdrop of the Bradshaw Mountains. The property, once the pride of Wickenburg's northern expanse, would become the center of what local newspapers only dared to reference as the unfortunate business at the edge of town. What began as a drought-year dispute over water rights evolved into something that local authorities would deliberately omit from official county records by 1892. The Callahan property was notable for its deep stone well, an engineering marvel that reached groundwater even during the harshest droughts. At some point during that fateful autumn, something changed about the well, something that would lead 3 separate families to abandon the property over the next 20 years. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not merely what was found in 1932 during a land survey, but the systematic efforts to keep the findings from public knowledge. According to limited records recovered from the Yavapai County Historical Society archive in 1964, before they were subsequently misplaced during a building renovation, the well contained something that could not be reconciled with the official account of the Callahan family's western migration, something that called into question everything known about Arizona's territorial expansion and the families who participated in it. Thomas Callahan, his wife Margaret, and their 5 children arrived in Wickenburg in 1887, having traveled from Missouri with promises of fertile land and opportunity. They purchased 320 acres approximately 7 miles north of town, near what would later become the Hassayampa River Preserve. The land was considered marginal, at best, except for one feature, a natural spring that allowed for the construction of what would become known locally as the Miracle Well. County tax assessor records from 1887 valued the property at twice the going rate for comparable acreage specifically due to this water source. What follows is an account pieced together from disparate sources: personal correspondence, county medical examiner notes, newspaper clippings, and fragments of diaries that survived decades of intentional obscurity. This is the story of the Callahan well and what happened to those who drank from it. The Callahans arrived with optimism typical of westward settlers. Thomas had been a carpenter in St. Louis, and Margaret came from farming stock in rural Missouri. Their 5 children, James 17, William 15, Sarah 13, Elizabeth 10, and young Robert 6, were described in a local welcome notice as bright-faced and sturdy, a credit to American pioneer stock. The eldest, James, was noted for his mechanical aptitude, while William had already demonstrated skill with livestock. The 3 younger children attended the newly established Wickenburg schoolhouse when weather and farm duties permitted. Their homestead was modest but functional. A 2-story main house constructed of local pine with a stone foundation, a barn for their 4 horses and small cattle herd, a chicken coop, and a workshop where Thomas practiced his carpentry. The property's centerpiece, however, was the well. Unlike most settlers who dug shallow wells that frequently ran dry, Thomas employed a technique he claimed to have learned from German engineers in St. Louis. The well shaft descended nearly 60 feet through limestone and granite, lined with mortared stone in a perfect cylinder. At the bottom, it tapped into what appeared to be an underground stream, a rare and valuable resource in the arid territory. Neighbors reported that even during the drought of early 1888, the Callahan well maintained at least 12 feet of clear, cold water. What few outside the family knew was that the well had not been Thomas's creation alone. According to a letter written by Margaret to her sister in Missouri, recovered from a collection of family papers donated to the Missouri Historical Society in 1952, the site for the well had been indicated by a local Yavapai man whom Thomas had employed briefly during the property's development. The letter, dated January 1888, mentioned that the man had refused payment, but had asked only that the family respect the water and remember that it comes from a place older than their God. This cryptic warning was dismissed by Thomas as superstitious nonsense. By spring of 1888, the Callahan farm was thriving compared to neighboring properties. Their garden produced vegetables in abundance, their livestock appeared healthy, and the family enjoyed a standard of living unusual for first-year settlers. Several neighbors arranged to haul water from the Callahan well during dry periods, typically in exchange for labor or goods. Samuel Wicks, editor of the Wickenburg Sentinel, visited the property in April 1888 and wrote a brief article praising the industry and engineering acumen of the Callahan family. He specifically mentioned the well water as being uncommonly sweet and refreshing, with properties that seemed to invigorate both man and beast. This would be the last positive public mention of the Callahan property. The original deed to the Callahan property, preserved in fragmentary form at the Arizona State Archives, contains an unusual notation in the margin, added approximately 3 months after the initial filing. The note, apparently written by County Clerk Theodore Simmons, reads, "Purchaser advised of previous abandonment by Mexican and indigenous attempts at settlement. Reason for abandonment not disclosed at buyer's request." This notation was subsequently crossed out and marked irrelevant to title by an unknown hand. Local Yavapai oral histories recorded by anthropologist Dr. I. Claire Westfield in 1952 make reference to an area matching the Callahan property's description as the place of thirsty spirits, or, in a more literal translation, where the dead drink. According to Westfield's notes, tribal elders were reluctant to elaborate, but indicated that the area had been considered taboo for at least 3 generations prior to white settlement. By June 1888, according to an entry in the diary of Elizabeth Callahan, recovered from a hope chest sold at a state auction in Phoenix in 1922, the family had begun to notice changes. "Mother says we must boil the water now," she wrote. "Father disagrees, but does not drink from the well himself anymore. James spent 3 hours staring into the well yesterday. When Mother called him for supper, he said he was listening to voices. Father whipped him for frightening the little ones." The diary entry coincided with the first recorded visit by Dr. Howard Pierce, Wickenburg's only physician at the time. His ledger, preserved in the University of Arizona Medical Archives, indicates a house call to the Callahan residence, North County, on June 17, 1888. The purpose was listed as consultation regarding water quality and associated ailments. No specific diagnosis was recorded, but Pierce prescribed laudanum for Mrs. Callahan and recommended the family use water from town until their well could be properly assessed. Elizabeth's diary, covering the period from January to July 1888, provides the most detailed contemporaneous account of the family's deterioration. Her entries initially focused on typical childhood concerns, school lessons, friendships, household chores, gradually shift to increasingly disturbed observations about her family members' behavior. "When I woke him, he said he was keeping hold so they wouldn't take Sarah next. Mother slapped him hard and made him pray for 2 hours. By early July, Elizabeth wrote that young Robert had begun collecting dead insects and small animals, which he would drop into the well while reciting what she described as nonsense words that sound like backwards talking. Sarah, the middle daughter, reportedly stopped speaking entirely, communicating only by drawing elaborate circular patterns that Elizabeth described as like looking down into deep water with many people drowning below. July brought the summer monsoon rains, temporarily alleviating water concerns throughout the region. A June 24th entry reads, "William won't sleep in his bed anymore. He drags his blanket to the well house each night. This morning I found him asleep with his arm dangling into the water." But according to a letter from neighbor Abigail Winters to her daughter in California, archived at the Charlotte Hall Museum in Prescott, the Callahan family's behavior had become increasingly concerning. "They keep to themselves now," she wrote on July 29, 1888. "The children no longer attend Sunday services, and Thomas has twice refused to allow visitors onto the property. Margaret was seen in town last Wednesday, purchasing unusual quantities of salt and quicklime, claiming it was for purification purposes. Winter's letter continues with an observation that would later be corroborated by other sources. The Callahan livestock appear particularly troubled of late. Their horses refuse to approach the well, becoming violently agitated when forced. Last Tuesday, I observed their entire herd of cattle standing in perfect circular formation around the well house, facing outward as though guarding against some approaching threat. According to Powell's notarized statement, discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1943 and subsequently filed with the County Historical Society, Callahan wished to revise his will, placing all property in the names of his 3 youngest children exclusively, with specific instructions that neither James nor William shall inherit any portion of the land, nor have any rights to the water thereon. When questioned about this unusual arrangement, Thomas reportedly stated only that the older boys have been corrupted and cannot be trusted with what's down there. Powell, disturbed by his client's demeanor, made a note to speak with Dr. They remained thus motionless from dawn until well past midday. The first official indication of serious trouble came on August 12, 1888, when Thomas Callahan appeared at the office of Wickenburg's only lawyer, Franklin Powell, Pierce about Thomas's mental state. Before he could do so, however, the situation at the Callahan property deteriorated rapidly. Powell's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1902, contains additional details not included in his official statement. He described Thomas Callahan as gaunt to the point of emaciation, despite claiming that the family's crops and livestock were thriving. Most notably, Powell recorded that Thomas insisted on conducting their meeting outdoors, refusing to enter the office, and positioned himself so that his shadow did not touch any water, including a small decorative fountain in Powell's garden. Throughout our conversation, Powell wrote, Callahan appeared distracted, frequently glancing at his own reflection in the fountain water as though expecting to see something else there. When a bird drank from the fountain, he became visibly distressed and abruptly terminated our meeting. On August 17, 1888, 17-year-old James Callahan walked into the Wickenburg Sheriff's Office shortly after dawn. According to the official report filed by Deputy Sheriff Calhoun Taylor, the young man was disheveled, dehydrated, and in a state of considerable distress. James requested immediate assistance at the family home, but refused to specify the nature of the emergency. He would say only that something in the water has changed them all. Taylor gathered 3 deputies and rode to the Callahan property, arriving at approximately 9:30 a.m. What they found would never be fully documented in any official capacity. The initial report, transcribed that same day, indicated only that the officers discovered a situation requiring medical and possibly spiritual intervention, and that Dr. Pierce was summoned immediately. The remainder of the report was either never completed or was removed from county records. What we know comes instead from a personal letter written by Deputy Taylor to his brother in Texas, discovered among family papers in 1956. In it, Taylor described entering the Callahan house to find Thomas and 15-year-old William sitting at the kitchen table, both staring fixedly at what appeared to be a mason jar full of well water. Margaret and the 3 younger children were not immediately located. The men did not acknowledge our presence, Taylor wrote, even when addressed directly. Thomas's lips were moving slightly, as though in conversation, though no sound emerged. The boy seemed to be listening intently to the water itself. Both exhibited signs of severe dehydration despite the full water jar before them, which remained untouched. When asked about the whereabouts of the rest of the family, Thomas reportedly looked up as though noticing the deputies for the first time and said simply, "They're with the others now, down where the voices are clearest." Taylor's letter indicates that he and another deputy proceeded to search the property, while the remaining officers secured Thomas and William. In the barn, they discovered Margaret Callahan and the 3 younger children. According to Taylor's account, all 5 were positioned in a circle around a large wooden barrel filled with water, presumably drawn from the well. None responded to the deputy's approach. Dr. Pierce, upon his arrival, determined that while physically alive, the family members appeared to be in a catatonic state, fixated on the water as though witnessing something within its depths. The most disturbing element of Taylor's letter is his description of what happened when he himself glanced into the barrel. For the briefest moment, I perceived what appeared to be faces in the water. Not reflections, understand, but as though looking through a window into a crowded room. The faces seemed to be pressed against the other side of some invisible barrier, mouths moving as though calling out. I recoiled immediately, but the image has haunted my sleep every night since. Taylor's letter to his brother, spanning 11 pages, goes into considerably more detail than would ever appear in any official document. He described the Callahan house as being in a state of bizarre disarray. All mirrors had been smashed or covered, he wrote. Every container capable of holding water had been emptied, save for the jar on the kitchen table and the barrel in the barn. Most disturbing were the walls of the children's bedroom, which had been covered with crude drawings executed apparently in mud mixed with blood. The drawings depicted what appeared to be human figures submerged in water, reaching upward toward a circular opening above them. The deputy also noted that the family's livestock was in catastrophic condition. The cattle and horses, though not visibly injured, were emaciated to the point of near death. The chicken coop contained only feathers and bones. Yet the family's garden was thriving to an unnatural degree. Vegetables of grotesque size and unwholesome appearance filled the plot, Taylor wrote. The corn stood nearly 8 feet tall, with stalks thick as a man's wrist, yet the kernels within the husk were black and appeared to be seeping a clear fluid similar to water, but with an oily sheen. All 7 members of the Callahan family were transported to town, where Dr. Pierce established a temporary infirmary in the back room of his office. According to his medical notes, the family exhibited symptoms consistent with severe dehydration, despite having apparently spent hours in proximity to water. More concerning were the psychological symptoms, catatonia alternating with periods of extreme agitation during which the patients would cry out for just one more look and attempt to escape. Dr. Pierce's medical journal, considerably more detailed than his official reports, described his attempts to administer water to the family members. The patients respond to water with a combination of intense craving and profound terror, he wrote. When offered drinking water, they initially reach for it with desperate eagerness, only to recoil at the last moment. Thomas Callahan, briefly lucid yesterday evening, begged me to understand that it's not water anymore, it's become a window, and they can reach through from the other side. Pierce also documented unusual physical findings. All family members exhibited a bluish discoloration of the fingertips and lips, typically associated with oxygen deprivation, yet their respiratory function appeared normal. More bizarrely, he noted that their eyes had developed an unusual reflective quality in dim light, similar to that observed in certain nocturnal animals. When examined with an ophthalmoscope, the retinal blood vessels appeared to contain minute mobile particulates of unknown nature. Within town, rumors spread quickly. By evening, a group of concerned citizens had formed to investigate the Callahan well themselves. Led by blacksmith John Ferguson and including several men from neighboring farms, the group arrived at the property just before sunset. What happened next exists only in fragments of testimony, as the official investigation was abruptly terminated on August 25th by direct order of the Territorial Governor's Office. According to a sworn statement by Ferguson, filed with Attorney Powell but never entered into court records, the men approached the well cautiously. Several reported hearing what sounded like multiple voices in conversation, emanating from the shaft despite its apparent emptiness. Ferguson, using a lantern lowered on a rope, attempted to examine the well's interior. The lantern descended some 40 feet, he stated, before the light revealed what appeared to be a chamber extending laterally from the main shaft. This seemed impossible given the well's construction, yet I saw with my own eyes what appeared to be a stone room containing several figures in motion. Before I could determine more, the rope was severed by some unseen force, and the lantern fell into the depths. The men immediately attempted to seal the well, rolling a large boulder over its mouth and weighing it down with additional stones. As they worked, Ferguson reported, the voices grew louder and more numerous, as though in protest. Several of our party claimed to hear their own names called out by voices belonging to deceased family members. Ferguson's statement includes testimony from Joseph Miller, a rancher whose property bordered the Callahans. Miller claimed that while the men worked to seal the well, he distinctly heard his daughter's voice calling to him from within the shaft, a daughter who had died of fever 3 years earlier. She called to me by name, Miller testified, and spoke of things only she could have known. She begged me to help her, saying she was cold and wet and couldn't find her way home. Most of the men fled after hearing these voices, but Ferguson, Miller, and 2 others remained to complete the sealing of the well. They worked through the night, and Ferguson reported that as dawn approached, the water level in the well began to rise rapidly, eventually overflowing onto the ground around the shaft despite the boulder partially blocking its mouth. The water moved in a manner contrary to natural law, he stated, flowing uphill in narrow streams that seemed to reach toward us like searching fingers. By the time Sheriff Marcus Reeves arrived the following morning with a larger contingent, including Dr. Pierce, the situation had escalated. The boulder sealing the well had somehow been displaced despite its considerable weight. More alarmingly, the water level had risen dramatically and was now overflowing onto the surrounding ground. Dr. Pierce took samples of the water for analysis, noting in his journal that it exhibited unusual properties, including a faint luminescence visible in darkness and a temperature significantly lower than would be expected given the ambient conditions. He recommended a complete quarantine of the property pending further investigation. Sheriff Reeves's official report of the scene, while circumspect, indicates that the ground surrounding the well had become saturated to a considerable distance, with standing pools forming in depressions despite the absence of recent rainfall. He ordered the construction of an earthen berm around the well to contain the overflow and posted deputies to maintain the quarantine. One of these deputies, Henry Wilson, kept an unofficial log of his observations during his shifts guarding the property. In entries dated August 19, 21, he described increasingly strange phenomena. Water continues to flow from the well at a rate that seems impossible given its source, he wrote on August 19th. The overflow has created a shallow pool approximately 30 yards in diameter, despite the intense heat, which should cause rapid evaporation. On August 20th, Wilson noted, observed unusual behavior in local wildlife. Coyotes, rabbits, and several species of birds have gathered at the perimeter of the flooded area but refuse to approach the water or drink from it. After sundown, noted several larger animals, possibly deer or elk, standing motionless at the property's edge, facing the well. His final entry, dated August 21st, reads, reflections in the water do not correspond to objects above. When looking at the pooled water, I can see things that aren't there, people moving about, structures that don't exist on the property. The faces are becoming clearer. Some appear to be watching me specifically. I have requested reassignment. On August 22nd, 3 days after the well was discovered unsealed, a telegram arrived from the territorial capital ordering Sheriff Reeves to cease all investigations and to prevent any further access to the Callahan property. The order, signed by Governor Conrad Meyer-Zulick himself, cited potential public health concerns, but provided no additional explanation. Armed deputies were posted at the property boundaries with instructions to turn away all visitors. The abruptness of this intervention and the involvement of the territorial governor in what appeared to be a local matter generated considerable speculation. The Wickenburg Sentinel, which had previously published Samuel Wickes's favorable account of the Callahan farm, now printed only a brief notice stating that the property had been quarantined due to possible contamination of water sources. No mention was made of the family's condition or the unusual phenomena reported by those who had visited the site. A telegram from Sheriff Reeves to the governor's office, preserved in the territorial archives but not discovered until 1957, suggests that local authorities were not satisfied with this explanation. Reeves requested clarification regarding jurisdiction and the nature of the supposed health risk, noting that the phenomena observed at the Callahan property do not correspond to any known form of water contamination. The governor's response, if any, is not preserved in the archives. The 7 members of the Callahan family remained under Dr. Pierce's care for approximately 2 weeks. According to his records, their physical condition improved with regular administration of fluids and nourishment, but their mental state remained severely compromised. On September 5, 1888, all 7 patients were transferred to the Territorial Asylum in Phoenix. The official diagnosis, as recorded in the transfer documents, was shared delusional disorder, precipitated by consumption of contaminated water, possibly containing natural compounds with hallucinogenic properties. This clinical explanation might have been accepted were it not for subsequent events. On September 7th, just 2 days after the family's transfer, the Callahan property was purchased by the territorial government for a sum significantly above market value. The deed of sale, executed with unusual haste, included a restrictive covenant prohibiting any use of the land for residential purposes or water extraction for a period of 99 years. The purchase was authorized directly by Governor Zulick, bypassing normal territorial acquisition procedures. Financial records indicate that the transaction was funded not from the territorial treasury, but from a special discretionary account maintained by the governor's office for matters of territorial security. This account received regular deposits from the U.S. War Department, suggesting federal interest in the property. Within a week, a contingent of U.S. Army engineers arrived from Fort Whipple and established a perimeter around the property. Local residents reported continuous activity at the site for approximately 10 days, including the sounds of explosions consistent with dynamiting. When the military personnel departed on September 23rd, the Callahan house, barn, and all other structures had been razed. The well itself, according to limited accounts from workers involved, had been filled with alternating layers of stone, quicklime, and salt before being sealed with a concrete cap and covered with earth. One of these workers, Michael Sullivan, later provided a sworn affidavit to Attorney Powell, discovered among Powell's personal papers in 1901, describing the military operation. The soldiers worked in shifts around the clock, Sullivan stated. Many refused to approach the well directly, and those who did were rotated frequently. They spoke little to us civilian laborers, but I overheard one officer telling another that it's spreading through the groundwater faster than we anticipated. Sullivan further claimed that before the well was sealed, multiple samples of the water were collected in specially constructed metal containers, which were then placed in crates, marked for transport to U.S. AMR, Washington, presumably the U.S. Army Medical Research Division. He also reported that several soldiers who had direct contact with the water were quarantined in a separate tent and later removed from the site on stretchers, apparently unconscious. Most disturbing was Sullivan's account of what happened during the final phase of the operation. As they prepared to seal the well with concrete, the water level suddenly rose, breaching the temporary barriers they had constructed. Several men were splashed. 3 of them began screaming immediately, claiming they could feel things moving beneath their skin. One clawed at his own eyes until restrained. The officer in charge ordered everyone back and had those affected stripped and scrubbed with alcohol and lye soap. Official records indicate that the property was redesignated as a watershed conservation area and placed under the jurisdiction of the Territorial Geologist's Office. No further official mention of the Callahan family or their well appears in government documents until 1932, when a land survey was conducted as part of Roosevelt's New Deal projects. The fate of the Callahan family remains partially obscured. Asylum records indicate that Thomas, Margaret, and the three youngest children died within 6 months of their admission, all listed as succumbing to wasting disease of unknown etiology. The children died first, Robert on October 12th, Elizabeth on November 7th, and Sarah on December 23rd, 1888. Margaret followed on January 19, 1889, and Thomas on February 28th. The attending physician's notes, preserved in fragmentary form, describe the progression of their condition. Patients exhibit increasing hydrophobia, fear of water, while simultaneously developing insatiable thirst. When denied water, they attempt to obtain moisture from any available source, including condensation on windows and plumbing fixtures. Paradoxically, when water is provided, they become severely agitated, claiming to see figures within it reaching toward them. In his final entry regarding Thomas Callahan, dated February 27, 1889, the physician wrote, "Patient insists that his family is not dead, but on the other side of the water. He claims they visit him nightly, their faces appearing in the water basin beside his bed, beckoning him to join them. Patient's physical deterioration accelerates. Skin has developed a bluish pallor and appears unusually thin, almost translucent in certain lights." James and William, however, were released after approximately 1 year, having apparently recovered enough function to be deemed non-threatening. They disappeared from official records until 1892, when William's name appears on a mining claim filed near Prescott. James vanished entirely until 1903, when a man matching his description was briefly detained in Flagstaff for disturbing the peace by preaching apocalyptic warnings regarding contaminated water sources. A sworn statement from Dr. Nathan Clark, who treated the Callahan brothers at the Territorial Asylum, provides additional context for their release. Unlike the other family members, Clark wrote, James and William appear to have developed a resistance to whatever affected the family. While they still exhibit periodic episodes of delusion regarding people in the water, they have learned to manage these episodes and can function in normal society, provided they adhere to certain self-imposed restrictions. These restrictions, as outlined in Clark's statement, included complete avoidance of large bodies of water, refusal to gaze into reflective surfaces for extended periods, and a peculiar ritual of placing salt in any water before using it for any purpose. Clark noted that both brothers maintained these practices rigorously and became severely distressed if prevented from doing so. William Callahan's subsequent life is somewhat better documented than his brothers. After filing his mining claim in 1892, he operated a moderately successful silver mine until 1897, when he sold the operation and relocated to Colorado. Census records from 1900 place him in Durango, working as a blacksmith and living alone. He appears to have led a quiet, unremarkable life until his death in 1919 from influenza during the global pandemic. One curious footnote to William's story appears in his obituary, published in the Durango Herald. Mr. Callahan was known locally for his charitable works, particularly his efforts to provide clean drinking water to impoverished areas of the city. He established and maintained several public wells, insisting on personally treating the water with a proprietary mineral formula he claimed improved its healthfulness. James Callahan's path was more erratic. After his brief detention in Flagstaff in 1903, he surfaces in various newspaper accounts across the Southwest, always in connection with his warnings about water contamination. A report from the Santa Fe New Mexican in 1905 describes him as a wild-eyed prophet of doom, who established a small following by demonstrating an uncanny ability to locate underground water sources while simultaneously warning against their use. By 1910, James had established what some accounts describe as a water cult in a remote area of southern New Mexico. According to limited reports, his followers practiced elaborate purification rituals involving salt, silver, and exposure to sunlight before consuming any water. Local authorities investigated the group several times but found no evidence of illegal activity. The cult apparently disbanded after James's disappearance in 1915 during a flash flood that struck their encampment. The story might have remained buried in fragmented records were it not for the Land Survey of 1932. Franklin Roosevelt Civilian Conservation Corps, tasked with mapping water resources throughout Arizona, included the former Callahan property in their assessment. The survey team, led by geologist Dr. Harrison Matthews, was apparently unaware of the property's history when they detected what appeared to be an underground water source using newly developed resistivity equipment. According to Matthews' field notes, partially preserved in the University of Arizona Department of Hydrology archives, the team located the concrete cap from the original well beneath approximately 4 feet of soil. Despite standing orders prohibiting disturbance of the site, Matthews authorized a small exploratory excavation, reasoning that the region's ongoing drought conditions justified investigating all potential water sources. On July 17, 1932, workers removed the concrete cap and discovered that the well shaft remained largely intact beneath. Matthews recorded that despite the 44 years that had passed since the well was sealed, the shaft contained approximately 30 feet of water. He noted, "The water appears remarkably clear and cold, with unusual refractive properties. When sunlight strikes the surface, the depth appears greater than our measurements indicate, suggesting some optical anomaly." Matthews extracted several gallons for testing and resealed the shaft pending laboratory results. His subsequent report, submitted to the Department of the Interior on July 29th, indicated that the water contained mineral compounds of unknown origin and recommended further study by specialists from the U.S. Geological Survey. This recommendation was evidently taken seriously as a team of federal researchers arrived at the site on August 3rd. Matthews's field journal, discovered among his personal effects after his death in 1949, contains observations not included in his official report. "The water exhibits properties inconsistent with known hydrological principles," he wrote on July 18th. "Despite removal of several gallons for testing, the water level in the shaft remains constant. More concerning is the behavior of the survey team after exposure to the water. 3 men who assisted with the extraction have reported identical dreams of drowning, despite sleeping in separate quarters." On July 20th, Matthews noted, "Photographic plates exposed near the well develop with unusual anomalies, specifically what appear to be human figures not present during exposure. Initial chemical analysis indicates water contains no known pathogenic organisms, but shows trace amounts of elements not typically found in groundwater, including rare earth metals and isotopes of silver in unusual configurations." His final entry, dated July 28th, reads, "Henderson, assistant geologist, spent several hours staring into water samples yesterday. Found him still at it this morning, unresponsive to verbal stimuli. When forcibly removed from the laboratory, he became violent, insisting that they were about to tell me something important. Have ordered all samples secured and team members to work in pairs. What happened during their investigation remains largely unknown." The official report, classified until 1964, stated only that the well contained water contaminated with industrial waste products of unknown origin and recommended permanent sealing of the site. No explanation was provided for how such contamination could have occurred in 1888, well before industrial development in the region. More telling is what happened to the investigation team. Of the 7 researchers present, 3 resigned from government service within 6 months. 1, chemist Dr. Eleanor Wright, committed suicide in December 1932, leaving a note that reportedly contained only the phrase, "They keep calling from the other side of the water." 2 others were admitted to psychiatric facilities by 1934 with symptoms described as persistent auditory hallucinations and parasitic delusions. Dr. Wright's personal journal, discovered after her death, provides the most comprehensive account of the team's experiences at the Callahan well. An accomplished scientist with multiple publications in respected journals, Wright's entries begin as methodical records of experimental procedures and observations, but gradually become more disjointed and personal. On August 5, 1932, she wrote, "Standard spectroscopic analysis reveals nothing unusual, yet the water's refractive index shifts unpredictably, sometimes while under direct observation. Under certain lighting conditions, particularly at dusk, the water appears to contain suspended particles that move independently of any current or agitation, movements that seem almost purposeful." By August 10th, her entries had taken a disturbing turn. The dreams continue. Not just drowning now, but specific scenarios. I am underwater in a stone chamber filled with people, men, women, and children from different eras, judging by their clothing. They reach toward me, mouths moving as though speaking, though I hear nothing. One woman appears repeatedly, approximately 35-40 years old, wearing clothing consistent with the late 1880s. She holds a child's hand and seems to be trying to show me something deeper in the chamber. Wright's final entry, dated December 4th, 1932, reads, "They're not in the water. The water is merely the threshold. They exist in a parallel space that intersects with ours, where groundwater collects. The Callahan well created a permanent junction point, but any standing water can become a temporary window under the right conditions. They've shown me how to cross over. The woman, I believe she must be Margaret Callahan, says they've been waiting for someone to understand. I will join them tonight and document what I find on the other side." The Callahan property was acquired by the federal government in 1933 and designated a restricted area under military jurisdiction. A permanent concrete bunker was constructed over the well site, and the entire area was fenced and posted with no trespassing signs, citing national security concerns. Local residents were informed that the site contained geological testing equipment of a sensitive nature. Aerial photographs from military archives declassified in 1972 show that the bunker was considerably larger than would be required simply to seal the well. The structure appears to have included multiple rooms and what resembles monitoring equipment. Regular personnel rotations to the site are documented in Army logistics records until 1945, when the facility was apparently downgraded to quarterly inspections. One of the military personnel stationed at the site in 1942-43, Sergeant Walter Reynolds, provided a sworn statement to congressional investigators in 1975 as part of a broader inquiry into classified Cold War projects. Reynolds testified that his unit's official mission was monitoring for possible groundwater contamination, but their actual activities focused on observing and documenting temporal anomalies associated with the water source. "We maintained a constant watch on the sealed well through specially constructed observation ports," Reynolds stated. "Our standing orders were to record any visual phenomena occurring in or around the containment vessel and to report immediately if the water level rose above a designated mark. Approximately once a month, senior officers from Washington would visit to collect our observation logs and conduct their own tests." Reynolds described these tests as involving photographic equipment, early sonar devices, and various measuring instruments, which were lowered into the well through a secure access port. He also mentioned that the officers occasionally brought test subjects, individuals in civilian clothing, who were allowed to observe the water under controlled conditions while their physiological responses were monitored. Most disturbing was Reynolds' claim that during his 14-month posting, 3 of these test subjects had to be forcibly restrained after attempting to breach the containment vessel and enter the water. They all exhibited the same behavior, he testified. After approximately 10 minutes of observation, they would become fixated on a specific point in the water, claim to see faces or figures, and then attempt to make physical contact. One woman broke through the safety restraints and managed to touch the water's surface before being pulled back. She immediately began convulsing and repeating the phrase, "They're still alive in there," until sedated. The The property remained under federal control until 1959, when jurisdiction was transferred to the newly formed Arizona Department of Water Resources. By this time, the Callahan incident had faded from local memory, existing only as fragmentary references in scattered historical documents. The transfer of jurisdiction appears to have been part of a broader reclassification of various government sites during the late 1950s. Internal memoranda from the Department of Defense, partially declassified in 1980, suggest that the Callahan site was considered no longer of strategic priority following the development of more advanced research facilities elsewhere. However, the transfer agreement included unusual provisions requiring the state authorities to maintain the existing containment structure and to continue regular monitoring of the site. Dr. Alan Friedman, who served as chief hydrologist for the Arizona Department of Water Resources from 1962 to 1968, later recalled that the Callahan property was unique among the department's responsibilities. "We had hundreds of monitoring stations across the state," he stated in a 1979 interview with the Arizona Republic, but only the Callahan site came with a dedicated federal budget allocation and a specific protocols established by the Army Corps of Engineers. "We were required to submit monthly reports, but were never told what precisely we were monitoring for." Friedman also mentioned that department employees assigned to the Callahan site frequently requested transfers after only a few months. When asked about the reasons for these requests, he acknowledged that some staff had reported unusual experiences, but declined to elaborate, citing confidentiality agreements he had signed during his tenure. In 1961, graduate student Rebecca Morrison from Arizona State University began researching water rights disputes in territorial Arizona for her doctoral dissertation. Her research led her to references of the Callahan property, and she filed a Freedom of Information request for access to the sealed government records. After nearly 2 years of bureaucratic resistance, she was granted limited access to the 1932 investigation files. Morrison's academic background was in environmental law, with a particular focus on water rights in arid regions. Her dissertation proposal, preserved in the ASU archives, indicates that she initially had no special interest in the Callahan property beyond its relevance to early territorial water disputes. Her FOIA request, filed in September 1961, sought information on all government appropriations of private water rights between 1880 and 1910. The response she received, dated January 1962, excluded the Callahan property from the General Release of Information, citing ongoing national security concerns. This unexpected classification of a seemingly minor historical case piqued Morrison's curiosity. She began a more focused investigation, filing additional requests specifically targeting the Callahan records and interviewing elderly residents of Wickenburg who might have family recollections of the incident. Morrison's research journal, recovered after her disappearance, documents her growing obsession with the case. "What began as a footnote in my dissertation has become its central focus," she wrote in October 1962. "The systematic removal of information about the Callahan property from public records suggests a cover-up of extraordinary proportions. Most puzzling is why a water rights case from 1888 would remain classified as a national security matter 74 years later." By early 1963, Morrison had assembled an impressive collection of fragmentary evidence from disparate sources, reconstructing much of the narrative preserved here. Her persistence appears to have attracted official attention. In March 1963, she reported being followed by men in government vehicles, and noted that her apartment had been searched while she was at the university. Shortly thereafter, she was approached by a man identifying himself as Dr. Richard Coleman from the U.S. Geological Survey, who offered to help her gain access to the classified files in exchange for sharing her findings. Morrison's subsequent attempts to locate and interview surviving members of the Matthews survey team led her to retired geologist Thomas Fernandez, who had been a junior member of the 1932 expedition. Now living in a veteran's home in Tucson, Fernandez initially refused to discuss the Callahan well. After persistent inquiries, however, he agreed to a single interview on condition that it not be recorded. According to Morrison's handwritten notes from this interview, found among her personal papers after her disappearance in 1968, Fernandez revealed that the 1932 team had discovered more than contaminated water. The well wasn't just a well, he reportedly stated. When we lowered cameras into the shaft, we found that it connected to what appeared to be an extensive underground chamber system, chambers that showed evidence of human habitation. Most disturbing was Fernandez's claim that among the artifacts recovered from a narrow ledge approximately 50 feet down the shaft was a collection of personal items identified as belonging to the Callahan family, items that, according to asylum records, had been with them when they died, including Margaret's wedding ring and Thomas's pocket watch. But that wasn't what drove Eleanor to kill herself, Fernandez told Morrison. It was the photographs. When we developed the film from the underwater camera, we saw them, dozens of people, in what looked like a submerged room, their faces pressed against the glass of our camera housing. Among them were 7 that matched the descriptions of the Callahan family, including the children. They didn't look dead. They looked like they were trying to communicate. Fernandez claimed that these photographs, along with most of the physical evidence collected from the site, were confiscated by military personnel who arrived unexpectedly during the 3rd day of the investigation. The research team was debriefed separately and required to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of prosecution for treason. He described experiencing recurring nightmares in which he was underwater but able to breathe, surrounded by people who had been missing or dead for decades. Most specifically, he claimed that Eleanor Wright, the chemist who committed suicide, continued to appear in these dreams, always trying to show me something deeper in the chambers, something the military never found. Toward the end of the interview, Fernandez made a statement that Morrison found particularly significant. The Callahan well isn't unique. Morrison's notes indicate that Fernandez became increasingly agitated as the interview progressed. There are others, places where the barrier between here and there is thinner. They've been found all over the world, always associated with unusual water sources. The military has a special division that deals with them now. Very black budget stuff. They call it threshold containment. Morrison's notes conclude with a disturbing observation. As she was leaving, Fernandez grasped her arm and said, "They'll come for you now. They monitor anyone who asks too many questions. And once you know about the water, it knows about you too. They'll find you through any reflection, any puddle. They're patient. They've been waiting since long before the Callahans arrived." Morrison's notes indicate that she attempted to corroborate Fernandez's account by locating other surviving team members, but was unsuccessful. Her dissertation, completed in 1964, made only passing reference to the Callahan incident as an example of water rights appropriation by governmental authorities under unusual circumstances. However, Morrison did not abandon her investigation. After receiving her doctorate, she secured a position as an adjunct professor at Northern Arizona University, which afforded her the academic credentials to pursue research grants. In 1966, she applied for and received funding from the National Science Foundation for a project ostensibly focused on historical water management practices in the American Southwest. Bank records and receipts found in her personal papers indicate that Morrison used a significant portion of this grant to purchase specialized equipment, including an early underwater camera system, ground-penetrating radar, and various water testing apparatus. She also corresponded with several experts in unconventional fields, including a parapsychologist from Duke University and a cryptozoologist who had published works on subterranean life forms. In 1967, Morrison returned to the area as part of a broader historical research project. County records indicate that she applied for and received permission to conduct a ground-penetrating radar survey of the former Callahan property, now officially designated as Watershed Conservation Area 37. The permit specified that no physical disturbance of the site was authorized. What is particularly notable about this permit is how easily it was granted. Despite the property's classified status just a few years earlier, Morrison's application was approved through standard channels with minimal bureaucratic resistance. This circumstance raised questions after her disappearance, with some speculating that she had been deliberately allowed access to the site. Morrison and two research assistants began their survey work on April 12, 1967. On April 14th, one of the assistants returned to Wickenburg in a state of extreme distress, reporting that Morrison and the other assistant had disappeared while taking readings near the concrete bunker covering the well site. A search and rescue operation was immediately initiated. The surviving assistant, graduate student Michael Chen, provided a statement to local authorities that was notably lacking in specific details. He claimed that he had been operating equipment in their vehicle when he heard a shout from the direction of the well. Upon investigating, he found no sign of Morrison or the other assistant, David Kaufman. After searching for approximately 30 minutes, Chen drove to town to report the disappearance. Search teams discovered Morrison's vehicle and equipment, including the radar unit, apparently abandoned. Her notebook contained partial readings, suggesting an anomalous void space extending approximately 200 feet horizontally from the well site, at a depth of 60-70 feet. The final entry, time-stamped 3:17 p.m. on April 13th, read simply, "Water rising through soil. Thomas was right." They're still down there. Despite an extensive search lasting nearly 2 weeks, no trace of Morrison or her assistant was ever found. The case was eventually classified as a missing persons investigation, with speculation focusing on the possibility that they had fallen into an undetected sinkhole or abandoned mine shaft. The concrete bunker was inspected and found to be secure, with no evidence of tampering. What the official report failed to mention was that during the search operation, 3 members of the search team reported unusual phenomena in the vicinity of the concrete bunker. According to a confidential memorandum later leaked to the Arizona Republic, these included unexplained cold spots, auditory hallucinations described as whispering voices, and the appearance of standing water in depressions where no rainfall had occurred. One search team member was hospitalized after becoming catatonic while examining a small pool of water near the bunker. Michael Chen, the surviving research assistant, provided additional details in a notarized statement to Morrison's family's attorney in 1969. In this account, which differs significantly from his initial report to authorities, Chen claimed that the team had detected what appeared to be a large underground chamber system extending from the well site. More disturbing was his assertion that their ground-penetrating radar had detected moving anomalies within these chambers, which Morrison had hypothesized might be air bubbles or water currents. According to Chen, on the afternoon of April 13th, Morrison had discovered that the soil around the concrete bunker was unusually damp, despite the region experiencing drought conditions. Using specialized testing equipment, she determined that the moisture had the same chemical composition as water samples she had previously obtained from historical records of the Callahan well. Dr. Morrison became extremely excited by this discovery, Chen stated. She believed it indicated that water from the sealed well was somehow permeating through or around the containment structure. She and David began taking soil core samples at increasing distances from the bunker, while I continued with the radar survey. Chen claimed that he was in the research vehicle, approximately 50 yards from the bunker, when he heard David Kaufman shout. Looking up, he saw Kaufman pointing at the ground near his feet, where water was apparently pooling rapidly. Morrison ran to Kaufman's position, and both began taking photographs and samples of the water. "The last time I saw them," Chen's statement concludes, "they were kneeling beside what had become a substantial pool of water, perhaps 3 feet in diameter. Dr. Morrison had placed her hand on the water's surface and appeared to be speaking, though I couldn't hear what she was saying. I turned away briefly to retrieve additional equipment from the vehicle, and when I looked back, both Dr. Morrison and David were gone. The pool of water remained, but it had stopped expanding. Chen admitted that he had not reported these details initially because I knew how it would sound, and I was afraid no one would believe me. He also revealed that in the weeks following the disappearance, he had experienced vivid dreams in which Rebecca and David appeared, seemingly trying to communicate from underwater. In the aftermath of Morrison's disappearance, the Arizona Department of Water Resources instituted stricter access controls for the site. A new security fence was installed, and quarterly inspections were mandated. Records of these inspections show no significant incidents until February 1968, when a routine check found that the concrete bunker had been breached from below, with what the report described as evidence of water pressure having displaced a section of the foundation. The inspection report, filed by senior hydrologist Walter Diaz, noted that the breach was approximately 18 inches in diameter and appeared to have occurred from within the containment structure. Most concerning was Diaz's observation that the water flow appears to pulsate at regular intervals, similar to a heartbeat. He also reported that small objects were occasionally ejected with the water flow, including fragments of what appear to be personal effects, buttons, fabric scraps, and in one instance, a partial leather wallet containing degraded paper consistent with currency. A repair team sent to reseal the bunker reported unusual difficulties, including equipment failures, and what the foreman's log described as persistent auditory phenomena resembling human voices. The team completed temporary repairs and recommended a more comprehensive containment solution. Water was flowing steadily from this opening, creating a small stream that extended approximately 20 yards before disappearing back into the ground. Before this could be implemented, however, the entire project file was redesignated as classified by order of the governor's office. The reclassification order, signed by Governor Jack Williams on March 3, 1968, cited potential threats to public health and state security. It mandated that all information regarding the Callahan property be removed from public access, and that a joint task force of state water resource officials and federal personnel be established to permanently resolve containment issues at the site. This task force, operating under the code name Operation Watershed, was deployed to the site in April 1968. Though no official records of their activities have ever been released, local witnesses reported extensive activity at the property throughout the spring and summer, including the construction of a much larger concrete structure over the original bunker and the installation of what appeared to be monitoring equipment on the property perimeter. One member of this task force, who spoke to the Phoenix New-Times in 1994 on condition of anonymity, claimed that the operation involved technology I'd never seen before, some of it clearly not of civilian origin. He described specialized diving equipment that allowed for extended underwater operations and monitoring devices that could detect specific changes in water molecular structure. Most notably, this anonymous source stated that the operation's primary goal was not merely containment but communication. They brought in people with unusual abilities, he claimed. Psychics, mediums, people who claimed to be able to remote view. They would sit them in front of tanks of water taken from around the bunker and ask them to make contact with whatever was on the other side. The most recent verifiable information about the Callahan well comes from a series of aerial photographs taken as part of a USGS mapping project in 1969. These images show that the concrete bunker had been replaced by a larger structure surrounded by what appears to be a reinforced perimeter. No official explanation for this construction was ever provided to the public. Local residents reported increased military presence in the area throughout the summer of 1969, including helicopter traffic and what one witness described as large water tanker trucks entering and leaving the site. By autumn, activity had ceased, and the property returned to its seemingly abandoned state, distinguished only by warning signs and a locked gate. In the decades since, the Callahan well has been largely forgotten, its story preserved only in scattered documents and the memories of elderly local residents. Occasional attempts by historians or journalists to investigate the site have been thwarted by bureaucratic obstacles and the deterioration or disappearance of key records. Perhaps the most intriguing development in recent years was a 1994 publication of a memoir by retired Army Colonel Victor Haynes, who claimed to have overseen military operations at several anomalous water sites during the 1960s and early 1970s. While Haynes never specifically mentioned the Callahan property, his descriptions of threshold phenomena associated with unusual water sources bear striking similarities to the documented events in Wickenburg. Haynes wrote of locations where water served as a permeable boundary between our reality and something else, not another place, precisely, but another state of existence. He described extensive government research into these phenomena, including attempts to establish communication with entities existing in a parallel phase state and experiments in cross-threshold transportation of material objects. Most relevant to the Callahan case was Haynes's assertion that individuals who disappeared in proximity to these water sources were not necessarily dead. We developed evidence, he wrote, suggesting that human consciousness, under certain conditions, could transition across the threshold while leaving no physical trace in our reality. More disturbing was the mounting evidence that such transitions might be reversible, raising complex questions about the nature of death itself. Haynes's memoir was removed from circulation shortly after publication, following a lawsuit by the Department of Defense alleging violations of national security protocols. Haynes himself disappeared from public view, and subsequent efforts to locate him have been unsuccessful. The Callahan well remains sealed to this day, its exact location obscured by decades of deliberate information suppression. The property continues to be restricted, ostensibly as a watershed conservation area, though no active management or research appears to take place there. Occasional rumors surface about unusual phenomena in the vicinity, unexplained lights, sounds of flowing water in dry stream beds, and inexplicable feelings of being watched. But no formal investigations have been authorized. What began as a water rights dispute in 1888 has become one of Arizona's most carefully buried historical incidents. The question remains, what exactly did the Callahan family find in their well? Was it, as some early accounts suggested, merely water contaminated with natural compounds that induced hallucinations and delusions? Or was there truth to the more disturbing reports that somehow the well provided access to something beneath the Arizona desert that should have remained undisturbed? Perhaps most unnerving is the consistency with which those who investigated the well described seeing faces in the water, faces of people who, by all official records, had died years or even decades earlier. The pattern extends from Deputy Taylor's letter in 1888 to the final notes of Rebecca Morrison in 1967, nearly 80 years later. Those who have studied the fragmentary evidence suggest various theories. Some propose that the well tapped into a previously unknown aquifer containing compounds with powerful psychoactive properties, compounds that induced shared hallucinations focused on water and drowning. Others speculate about natural gas pockets creating oxygen-depleted air that caused disorientation and delusions in those who visited the site. More fringe theories suggest that the Callahan well somehow connected to an underground civilization, or that it created a wormhole to another dimension where the laws of physics operate differently. Some even propose that the water itself was sentient, or served as a medium for a non-human intelligence attempting to communicate with our world. Whatever the truth, the pattern of official suppression is undeniable. From the territorial governor's intervention in 1888 to the reclassification of Morrison's findings in 1968, governmental authorities at all levels have consistently acted to restrict access to information about the Callahan well and to physically isolate the site itself. The current status of watershed conservation area of the Macabre 37 is difficult to determine. Satellite imagery shows only an unremarkable patch of desert scrubland. Public records requests regarding the site are routinely denied, citing various exemptions related to critical infrastructure protection. The Department of Water Resources maintains that the area is simply part of ongoing groundwater monitoring operations of no special significance. Yet occasionally, usually during periods of unusual rainfall, residents of the areas nearest the old Callahan property report hearing what sounds like distant voices carried on the wind. Some claim to have seen lights moving beneath the surface of temporary rainwater pools, lights that seem to follow observers and vanish when approached. Local folklore advises against drinking from unfamiliar water sources in the region, particularly after dark. In 2011, a hiker who had strayed from marked trails near the presumed location of the Callahan property reported finding an unusual concrete structure partially exposed by erosion. While examining the door, he noticed water seeping from beneath it, water that he described as unnaturally cold and slightly luminescent in the late afternoon light. Most disturbing was his claim that, as he bent to touch the water, he briefly saw what appeared to be a face reflected in it. Not my own face, but that of a young woman with an expression of desperate urgency. When he recoiled in surprise, the face vanished, but he reported hearing what sounded like a distant voice, saying, "Help us!" According to his account, posted anonymously on a paranormal research website, the structure had a small, rusted metal door secured with multiple padlocks. "We're still here." The hiker claimed that when he returned to the site the following day with a camera, the structure was no longer visible, with no evidence that it had ever existed. His online post was removed within hours of publication, and attempts to contact him have been unsuccessful. Their published results include a curious anomaly in the vicinity of the former Callahan property, a localized thermal inversion inconsistent with known aquifer patterns. The paper notes that this anomaly was not investigated directly due to access restrictions imposed by regulatory authorities. One of the researchers involved in this survey, speaking off the record to a graduate student, reportedly stated that their equipment had detected what appeared to be regular vibrational patterns in the groundwater beneath the site, patterns that resembled encoded information rather than natural geological processes. The university subsequently discontinued this line of research, citing budget constraints. As recently as 2016, researchers from the University of Arizona Department of Hydrology conducted a remote sensing survey of groundwater resources in Yavapai County. In the words of James Callahan, the only member of the family who might have escaped whatever fate befell the others, something in the water has changed them all. Perhaps the true horror of the Callahan well is not what was found within it, but what might still remain there, waiting beneath the Arizona desert, separated from our world by nothing more than a barrier of water calling out to those who might listen too closely to the voices from the other side. For those who study such phenomena, the Callahan well represents a particularly disturbing possibility that what we perceive as death may not be an ending but a transition, that consciousness might persist in states we cannot comprehend, and that under certain conditions the boundary between these states can become permeable. If the fragmentary accounts are to be believed, the Callahans may not have died in any conventional sense. They may simply have gone elsewhere, to a place from which they have been trying to return for over a century. Perhaps most chilling is the implication that they are not alone there. If the witnesses are to be believed, the other side of the water is populated by countless others, possibly everyone who has ever drowned, or perhaps those who died near certain types of water sources. This suggests an entire parallel population existing just beyond our perception, separated by the thinnest of barriers, constantly seeking ways to make contact or perhaps to return. The Callahan well may be sealed, but its story continues to seep through the cracks in official narratives. much like the water that reportedly breached the concrete bunker from below. And just as the water carries traces of what lies beneath, fragments of personal items, inexplicable reflections, voices that should not exist, the story carries with it an unsettling question. What happens when the barriers between worlds fail completely? What comes through from the other side of the water when there is nothing left to hold it back? For now, the well remains contained, the voices muted, the faces visible only in brief, uncertain glimpses. But water is patient, persistent, finding paths through even the most solid barriers given sufficient time. And if the accounts of the Callahan well teach us anything, it is that whatever waits on the other side of the water has been patient for a very long time indeed. Perhaps tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you might pause to consider the water that surrounds us daily, in pipes and glasses, pools and puddles, even the moisture in the air we breathe. And perhaps, just perhaps, you might wonder if sometimes, when you catch an unexpected reflection or hear an indistinct sound from the bathroom sink, something on the other side is wondering about you too.